Okay, I think I just will begin and then we will see how to continue. So I'm really very happy to welcome you to the first colloquium in the new Institute Cultures of Alps here in Altdorf. It is the opening of an, let's say, official research exchange series. And as you can note, our colloquium today is more than colloquial. It is a great gathering of researchers from different disciplines, such as American studies, anthropology, history, or even climate science. I'm very pleased that all or nearly all Alpine countries are represented. I see Germany, Italy, Austria, France. So it's really international today, and it's really due to this virus. And so I think it's a good opportunity to speak about hyperobjects. The colloquium is entitled Hyperobjects, Quake in Being, like the first chapter you have read for today in Timothy Morton's book on philosophy and ecology after the end of the world, published 7 years ago in 2013. So exceptionally, I have prepared a presentation because I knew that there will be other persons that we not will be only in our little circle. It is a presentation you can always interrupt, so please interrupt me by raising questions and completing or resisting to my points. I will do. First of all, I want to contextualize shortly the colloquium in the research framework of the new Institut, Kulturen der Alpen, Culture delle Alpi, Culture des Alpes, Cultures of Alps. So 3 remarks. First, just look at this. Remark 1, the Alps, seen as cultural natural space, have a long tradition of interference between human and so-called non-human. Remark 2, there is scarcely another geographical space with such a frequency of structural and cultural changes. In the picture, the impact of snowmaking somewhere in Austria, the impact of snowmaking on the landscape. And remark 3, the Alps are outstandingly exposed to and affected by global warming. So that's my pre-remark. And so let's come to our chapter. I can give you only some hints in order to understand the new approach, the Quake in Being, let's say more exactly. So please interrupt, and when you do it, just present yourself shortly with your name and your background in 1 sentence. After my reading and rereading of the first chapter in Morton's book, I would like just to touch on four topics. First, on the gap between thing and phenomenon. Second, on the loss of world. Thirdly, on the question what hyperobjects involve, their properties. And last but not least, on the consequences for our description modes and research designs. So let's sketch the first topic. Let's say the Kantian gap between phenomenon and thing. Kant gives a highly appropriated example for hyperobjects in his critique of pure reason, also in der Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the example of raindrop. So on the phenomenological side, you can feel the raindrop on your skin, on your hair. On the other ontological side, you cannot perceive the actual raindrop in itself. It is like, you know, you feel exactly the weather, but you cannot directly deduce or conclude the global climate, though you know that there is a statistical, let's say, a statistical relationship between weather and global climate. We have to acknowledge the deep and unbridgeable gap between our perception and the thing. Or, as Edmund Husserl states in his phenomenology, I have just to mute somebody here. Husserl states in his phenomenology, no matter how many times you turned around a coin, you never saw the other side as the other side. So one side is the phenomenological side, the other is the ontological side. So we have to ask, why is the concept world no longer operational? I would state, together with Timothy Morton, the concept world is no longer operational because of geological transformation of Earth by humans increased by vivid orders of magnitude. As much as Timothy Morton is skeptical about the term Anthropocene, this new epoch marks the end of the world. I would like to show you, just to go back, I just want to show you the exceeding of previous world categories on the basis of 3 features of global warming. I have already mentioned in my book on CO2. So feature 1, here you can see 1/10,000th, also ein Zehntausendstel of the whole 4 billion years geohistory, the so-called Pleistocene. It is the last epoch of ice ages and warm periods. And you see here the red line, the CO2 level. The CO2 level was never higher than 300 parts per million. During the last 3 generations, we reached a much higher level that goes far beyond. Can you see the whole picture? Okay, because I'm really interested in this, what's going on here. It goes far beyond all environmental conditions to which our fauna and flora are adapted. Hence, the massive loss of biodiversity and the huge potential for global warming out of any previous scale. So you have just to look at this blue line, and it's terrifying because we have now a high potential for increasing temperatures, and it's not about 1.5 degree. So we continue. Yes, so we have to ask together with Timothy Morton, why do we crash into the iceberg of hyperobjects so quickly with our Titanic of modernity? Because, yes, because, and here you have the picture of it, because we burn fossil fuels gathered in the long Carboniferous epoch, which lasted at least 15 million years and was more than 300 million years ago. For 3 generations, so let's say for 60 years, we have been intervening massively in the geohistory, which exceeds our own prehistory as a species by a factor of 1,000. That's why within a very short time, we have crossed the planetary boundaries and our reference to world. And actually, there is no need to discuss when exactly the Anthropocene began. Was it already the Neolithic revolution 10,000 years ago, or was it in the invention of the steam engine by James Watt in the end of the 18th century? Or was it only after 1945 when humankind laid a layer of radioactive material and when began the great acceleration? And I also think that there is no need to discuss whether the term Anthropocene is correct. This discussion would only be some symptom of the fact that we have been ramming the iceberg for some time now, and that we are still pretending we can continue with categories we know so far. I think now it will be just a place for questions, for additions. What could you add?
I have a question, Boris. My name is Andreas Bäumler. I'm working with Boris at the Institute. It seems to me that you talked about now about the actual Earth, right? But in the text, there is a difference between the actual Earth and the concept of world. And I'm not sure what that concept of world is and how it differs from the actual Earth.
Yes, this is a good question for everybody, I think.
I would like to comment on that. Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. So in this contextualization, I would say that this text is based on the intersection of two contexts. One is this which is Boris explaining and presenting here, which we can call ecological emergency or something like that. And the other is a philosophical issue, a philosophical context, which deals with this attempt to shift from anthropocentric approach in thinking. And of course it is connected. Those two contexts are very much connected, because it's obvious idea behind the text that this anthropocentric way of thinking is somehow responsible for the ecological emergence. No? And this has the implications, of course, on the very concrete question that Andreas asked, because this idea, this philosophical notion of the world is somehow responsible for the danger in which concrete real world is put in. No?
So if I understand you correctly, it could be something like episteme. Concept of world is like episteme.
There are, of course, many different, this is maybe one of the oldest debates in history of philosophy, of course, and it can be defined in many different theories. One of them can be Foucault's theory, but you can also frame it in the language or theories like debate between Plato and Aristotle, or in medieval times, nominalism and what was this, realism, or any other of today, post-structuralist theories. But for me, the most referential here is the notion of the world, which is referred to Heidegger's theory and ontology. You know, because this is one of the crucial notions in Heidegger philosophy. Also, both in early period of being and time and his later period when he was dealing with the question of technology. And I think that here we have really important reference on Heidegger, and not only, of course, on Husserl and Kant, but maybe I would leave for later comments some of my thoughts about this clash between modernity and hyperobjects, and Morton's idea of revolution, which he rephrases in another terminology like cognitive configuration and things like that. But I would be ready to talk more about that later. By the way, I am Sreten Ubričić, a philosopher and a writer, and also a PhD student of Boris.
If I could add just one comment. My name is Christian Quendler. I'm directing a research project on mountain cinema here at the University of Innsbruck. And I'm here with my colleagues, Eva Maria Müller, Johannes Fitt, and Benita Lehmann. Yeah, I would like to thank very much Previšić for pointing this out. And I think what's beautiful about Morton's approach is that this reconceptualization of Earth and world, as proposed by Heidegger, is done in a different context. I think one thing is obvious, right? When we look at Heidegger's distinction between Earth and world, it's a war of giants, as he describes it in his Kunstwerkaufsatz. It's kind of like a post-war situation where we have the Earth fighting against the world, and if something that modernism has told us is that this war, if it's conceived as a struggle, must be looked at in a more subtle ways, kind of like the steam or the carbon dioxide that rests on the Earth. So I think the context is important for reconceptualizing our philosophical vocabulary, and I think that's very important. I was surprised, and it's just a footnote I want to bring in also perhaps for a later discussion, by sort of calling for an end of the world. I was surprised, and also, so he calls for an end of the world, or he claims the world's ended, both conceptually and physically, and he distances himself from postmodernism, right? And so one thing, and I tried to look it up again, that struck me was that he's not addressing Baudrillard, right, who wrote a book, The Illusion of the End, which would be another context that's really implicit in his book, saying, so the illusion of the end is the discourse of catastrophe, or the apocalyptic discourse, is really just a fantasy of redemption that we contemplate because we are totally detached from nature. So that would be Baudrillard's position. We're just within a screen landscape, or a screened landscape. So that would be, I think, the other opposite that could be useful to understand his call for his claim that the world has already ended, I think. So we see, and I think that's very interesting, we just have to reconceptualize our notion of world, and it's supposedly antagonist Earth in an interesting way. But it's, what I think is beautiful is that it shows us how we need to update our vocabulary, and in this way I think he's very Heideggerian, if one could say so. Yeah.
I think he wouldn't agree that he's Heideggerian, but he knows what he wants from him, and I think because Heidegger was really near this gap between the phenomenon and the ontological side of the thing, or the object. do you want to add something, or should I continue a little bit? Because I have yes, Lisa.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Lisa Lee Benjamin, and also a new student of Boris for the PhD. And just something to add that I think is really important that I have added is also, and Michel Serres had a book called The Natural Contract, that kind of with this idea of worlding or the earth, that this updating I think is quite important, and that we're finding these different terms, whether it's Anthropocene, or one of the things I like at the moment is Donna Haraway and Anna Singh, of kind of looking at this Plantationocene, kind of as the plantation sort of created some of the situation that we're in, but looking at it more as a history of how we got where we are. And I think also not with this, I agree very much with this fantasy of this apocalyptic notion that we're kind of attached to that, and that more that there's really, I guess I'll always be an advocate for the positivity, that it's sort of updating our consciousness. We have a chance to create new contracts. And so Michel Serres and this natural contract, that we're always negotiating our place in the world, you know, and then also our place in the earth, and that how do we sort of look at renegotiating these. And I think the terms that come about, or even the sense of hyperobject, they're new perspectives that we have that we can kind of, in that philosophical way, sort of in this update. So I think that that's really nice to see, yeah, also in this text as well, is just trying to navigate, you know, and it's really a navigation and a new placement. But in a lot of ways, it's actually an update of consciousness as well, you know, can kind of see that we start to see things in other ways. They start to extend, they have fingers, they no longer have the same boundaries they used to have. And so it's a kind of, I think in that sense of updating, I really appreciate that as well. But yeah, it's a difficult negotiation always, navigation. So, but thank you very much for.
Okay, I think we should just go to the hyperobjects themselves. So I want to share and continue. So let's look at the properties of hyperobjects just by quoting from the following chapters of the book. So I suggest to continue in the book what's his. I mean, it's just an extract from the further chapters, what he's talking about with viscosity. Just quote, "Distance is only a psychic and ideological construct designed to protect me from the nearness of things." And in this context, it speaks about radioactive material, non-locality. Hyperobjects confound the social and psychic instruments we use to measure them. Even digital devices have trouble. And then further in the text, quote, "Global warming requires tremendous computing power to model in a realistic way," unquote. So I will just add the three more properties. Temporal ondulation, time bends the hyperobjects and flatten them. We already know weather like the back of our hand, but this is weird weather, this global warming weather. Phasing, objects seem to contain more than themselves. A flock of birds on a lake is a unique entity, yet it is also part of a series of hyperobjects. The biosphere, evolution, global warming. And last quote for interobjectivity, quote, "Futurality is reinscribed into the present, ending the metaphysics of presence, because the very large finitude of hyperobjects forces humans to coexist with strange future, a future without us," unquote. And in this context, he speaks about amortization rate of more than 24,000 years for plutonium, and of more than 100,000 years for global warming. And I just would suggest these quotes for discussing about the properties of hyperobjects.
Christian Quella. If I could just maybe begin with one observation or a question, and it seems it's something. So here we are trying to describe the features of an object that isn't really an object, or an object that at the same time wishes to displace subject-object dichotomy. So it's a hyperobject is almost like a pedagogical object that helps us to get rid of objects in some way. So one thing these features seem to have in common is they're all synthetic networks. So they stress relational qualities rather than discrete attributes. I don't know, maybe that's something. So it's a time space. The viscosity, of course, is we can read. We can see Latour here. The terror of no, was it the tyranny of space that haunts the viscosity of things, and yeah. So I think it's these are interesting features in the sense that they really are synthetic, relational, network centered, and yeah, so maybe that's a starting point. Also the facing, so the objects that are kind of spheric in a sense. So I think they all seem to share this propensity.
I would just briefly emphasize the distinction between hyperobject and the object, referring to object-oriented ontology theory. No? Because for me, it's not clear enough, really. When I see this nicely written, rhetorically, but philosophically not that persuasive enough distinctions or examples of what objects are or can be, and hyperobjects, it looks that everything can be everything, no? So it is important for me to make more clear. Unfortunately, I read only this first introductory chapter of the book. Maybe in the whole book there is a more clear analysis and distinctions made. Anyway, just to have in mind all the time this distinction between hyperobject and the object, simultaneously with this important Kantian distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, which is from both sides important for this discussion. And just to put one question mark regarding all of that, and he says that the hyperobject is not a function of our knowledge, that this hyperity of hyperobject is relative to, he says, worms and lemons and ultraviolet rays, as well as humans. No? But my question to whom would be, how you know this? Why your vision of this relation or non-relation relations is the correct relation? how you dare to say that only your view is a non-perspective view, non-centric view. So this is very old counter-argument to this position. And from that point of view, it looks to me that there is some level of naivete in this all of these theories of speculative realism and this urge of non-perspective thinking. Just a question mark.
If I may, thank you for sharing your thoughts. My question or comment really pertains to that relationship between object and hyperobject as well. When I started reading the introduction, and I also am only familiar with the first chapter of his book, I sort of being interested in mountains, I sort of got hung up on the property of non-locality. We know as scholars in mountain studies that they are both material and cultural realities, but they are, and living in Innsbruck, it's very evident that there is a material and natural reality to that. And I was wondering what sort of position do mountains take? How do mountains work as a medium that negotiates between humans and hyperobjects? And what is the massive computing system? What is this massive analysis system that we as scholars in the humanities put against mountains in order to make sense of these hyperobjects? This was something that, yeah, that I'd be interested in exploring further. My name is Eva. I'm part of Christian Quender's research team at the University of Innsbruck, and my previous sort of approach to mountain studies has been through post-colonial theory and eco-criticism. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Sorry.
This is Veronica, also a student of Boris's. To reflect on what you both said and stressing for the most part, I also had a big problem with, well, actually only with the notion of hyperobject, and I found it quite irritating when I read the introduction. So I read the whole book to kind of put to ease this irritation, and it didn't happen because I mean, in the end, that's just the tip of the iceberg, if you want. That one of the last sentences is that in a strange way, every object is a hyperobject, he states. But then he brings examples for hyperobjects, like devotional singing is a hyperobject, and I think London is a hyperobject, and slowly everything becomes a hyperobject. So it makes me question the very utility of the notion of hyperobject. If everything is a hyperobject, then nothing is a hyperobject. Do you understand what I mean? So this would be the question, my question. What is it good for? To name things hyperobjects, while at the same time, Morton mostly, when he says hyperobject, means global warming or means radiation, and talks mostly about these things. But he creates this concept which kind of englobes many more things in his claim, but I don't see the utility anymore, the usefulness.
I don't know, just a question to respond to that. I wonder, kind of going back more in religious times, there was, I'm not going to remember where it's from, but kind of in these times of organizing our world, like we had this group is called grapes and this group is called rocks, and we created naming also of this classification to kind of help us navigate. And I wonder, as we enter sort of new times in that sense of naming, you know, that kind of getting comfortable with different things because they're outside of the boundaries. Because I definitely also see the danger of everything being everything, or, you know, not creating that utility. But a lot of times the utilities we created were just to service a purpose of the time that was kind of advantageous for us, that navigation at that point in history. Yeah, because I think that's also a very interesting question of how, with the times now, getting used to those names, because sometimes they're arbitrary, but they help us navigate, or they serve a certain purpose at a moment.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment in response to Veronica. I think I would agree. It's very frustrating to define the object, and it's partly frustrating because he calls it hyperobjects. But it also points out, and I'm here just repeating what Lisa just said, that the kind of reasoning that, you know, if it's everything, it's nothing, is precisely the problem. The all or nothing dichotomy that we like to that we often sort of approach the world with is, I think, what he's getting up against, right? So if everything is an hyperobject, then it's nothing, and it's I think this kind of intuitive logic that may also be a problem, without criticizing your intervention.
Can I do that quickly? My point is exactly that maybe we should talk about things rather than talking about a general concept of things. And that would be more in his, that would be more honest to his own spirit if he would do that. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, sorry.
I just would like to mention the fourth point, the phasing, where you have the object, this flock of birds on a lake, as a unique entity. That's clearly object. I think there is not everything is everything here. The object it depends on the definition, and on the other side, it's also part of series of hyperobjects as biosphere, evolution, global warming, and so on. So he knows exactly what the hyperobject is. Only that that the objects are also part of it because of the hyperobjects. And then we have also to distinguish between hyperobjects made by humankind and others, as climate or biosphere in general. That I think he gives us, especially in this first part of his book. So we should really continue the book, but where he defines the properties of hyperobjects, he gives us really, I think, good definitions for distinguishing between object and hyperobject. Only that concrete object can also be part of the hyperobject. And that's why I think the example you gave, Eva, the mountains, that's, for me, it's like this flock of birds. So it's, on the one hand, it's a thing, but on the other hand, it's also part, and it's really an interesting part of the biosphere for showing, for example, global warming. So it's part of the hyperobject.
Yeah, and in this sense, it works as a medium to help us understand or read hyperobjects, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I personally did a check with the 5 properties of the mountains for myself, since that's what I'm most interested in. And we can see all these dimensions, of course, all these features in mountains. But I just want to mention one aspect, and that's perhaps relates to the facing, right? So when we think of mountains, we may think, well, but they're very local, right? They don't move at all. But we have it very explicitly in the notion of Gebirge and Gestein, right? That it's clearly an entity that cannot be faced in in sort of discrete things. It's, I think, what's also associated with sort of Eastern notions of landscape. So the Gestein and the Gebirge is precisely this multitude of things that form an object, I guess.
Okay, I think I have to give my ideas and comments. I'm Michael Engelhardt. I'm an actor, and I'm specialized in speaking poems of Mr. Friedrich Hölderlin, the big friend of Hegel, Schelling, and the reader of Kant, born in 77 like Beethoven. First, just because it was the last thing, mountains don't move. Yes, they do. We are walking on shells and on former sea ground when we are walking in the mountains, and that's something Morten also mentioned. So the awareness, the conscious of what is the world I'm standing on or walking on or breathing in or whatever. I think, and this, I always look through the glasses of Mr. Hölderlin and his poems. What is missing for me in this whole discussion till now is the I, the me, the real living subject known as me, because not everything can be everything, but I can decide what is an hyperobject. And I think the power of, when I read this chapter, for me, the power was this indirect touching and hitting the responsibility of behavior, thinking, awareness in this catastrophe we are living now. And the question of what's the gap between phenomenology, and things, for me, it's more important the gap between knowledge and behavior. I'm looking at this whole discussion Boris is starting with this meeting. How can we bring the responsibility and the power back into this gap of knowledge and behavior? I hope I make myself clear that the subject of me and I, coming to the end, the Corona crisis, for me, how I look at it, is exactly to the point now, because it's addressing everyone in responsibility and is starting up a big discussion. What is allowed to do? Who is telling me what's allowed? What is fake news? What is real? What is science? Big disaster, big confusion. And in the end, everyone knows, I think so, I'm thinking so, everyone knows it's my own decision of behavior and of thinking about all this knowledge. And the last idea I want to bring in, then I'm finished, the language. It's all about the language. And I love Mr. Morten for his language, because he is making a nice sort of theater. I saw him on YouTube a couple of half hours, and he's really a good performer. And in his book also, he's using I think, in my opinion, he's using the term hyperobject not to be right, not to renew philosophy, but to bring in an arrow, a kind of power and force of thinking and responsibility to every subject, to every man. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your statement. Perhaps we should also distinguish a little bit between the role of the subject as it is defined by Hölderlin and the whole Romantic group im ältesten Systemprogramm. I would not agree with you that that we can decide, because we are decided by processes we began 200 years ago. And that's the big issue. And that's why I don't think that, I think you're right with the language and his performance he does, but it's also a performance not from a subject that, how to say, who knows, who is in this meta position just to handle the text, and that's why he's always searching his text. He's always making circles and so on. It's
sorry, who is he? Hölderlin or Morton?
No, I'm talking about Timothy Morton.
Okay.
Yes, but you're right for the question because it could also be Hölderlin. Yes. Eva, I saw you that you didn't agree, actually.
No, yeah. Thank you, Michael, for your comment as well. And I like Boris. I agree with Boris to disagree with you on the fact that hyperobjects are not something that we can decide upon. We know with global warming or with COVID-19, they hit us regardless of whether we acknowledge their force or not. However, I do agree with you on, and I think this kind of also reaches back to the discussion that we had earlier about utility, the relationship between knowledge and behavior and responsibility. And I would, rather than thinking of like a romantic I would hope that, and I think that this is also what Morton gestures towards, I think that if we think of if we look at our role, the human role in relationship in regard to hyperobjects, we have to think about us as a collective I rather than an individual I. Yeah, so that would be my comment on that, yeah, relationship between object, subject, and hyperobject.
Yes, but the key point there would be that these I's, collective or individual, are just object among all other objects. And only if we take that non-centric, non-anthropocentric position, we will be able to gain the moral platform on which we can properly act in such circumstances in which we find ourselves now. So yes, I agree with Michael that we have these different stages of the issue. First stage is this perception paradox between phenomenon and noumenon, and then cognition, and then this relation between perception and cognition, and then on the next level between cognition and decision, and then from decision level to action or what we should do. and how. So yes, to have all of this in mind.
So Sreten, if I understand you well, you don't disagree anymore with Morten.
Now what comes to my mind about the key notion of hyperobject is this Hitchcock notion of MacGuffin. I don't know if you are familiar with this. MacGuffin is something which is totally virtual, not existent, but initiates the narration. And narration moves around and develops because and around that something which is something which nobody knows what it is. It's totally irrelevant if this exists or doesn't exist. So very clear example of MacGuffin. So it's irrelevant if it exists or doesn't exist. So it is good to start the debate or the talk of these issues which are so urgent. So in this way, I like it.
I'm not sure if Morten would agree with you. So perhaps I just continue because I want to come also to language, to speak about language. I think because it's also concerning our, let's say, research designs in modern English. I think research design is something like stemming from the modern times, but I don't care for the moment. Yes, Christian.
Sorry for interrupting, but I think this is a perfect segue also to the issue of meta language, which has just been pointed out. I think there is an agreement with Previšić, I'm sorry, is Previšić your last name? Yeah, with what you've just said and Timothy Morten. But there's also disagreement when it comes to the hierarchy, right? The levels that you've just outlined of cognition, perception, cognition, ethical decision making. These are very functional, analytical distinctions that make sense, I'm sure. But I think it's something this hierarchy is not something that that Morten would subscribe to, but rather contest. And I think that brings us into this issue of meta language, right? So how do we establish these hierarchies, or aren't there really just heterarchies that we're dealing with? And I think that may also give us some answers to who is speaking or what is the position of making these claims in a way. But I thought that was a great, a very productive comment that you've made that could is certainly relevant for the discussion of meta language.
So just let us jump into Morten. The time of hyperobjects is a time of hypocrisy, yet for the same reason seeking out hypocrisy cannot be done from the point of view of cynicism. If there is no meta-language, then cynical distance, the dominant ideological mode of the left, is in very bad shape and will not be able to cope with the time of hyperobjects. So we can state with Morten, we don't have, I mean, I broke it down a little bit, but we don't have a language that can capture the object in the way of the hyperobject. Our being, or our cultural being and so on, is not only constructed in our minds, it's also a product of geological, biospheric and so on processes. And then last point, there is no distance, there is no cynical distance, there is no meta position, no meta language in order to describe this this hyperobjects. So that's my point here concerning language. But now I just want to conclude the presentation, then we can discuss further. Anyway, so I would just like to point out two of Timothy Morton's conclusions in this first chapter. The first conclusion would be we have to deepen an object-oriented ontology. So he is beyond any idealism, holism, or whatever ism. I mean, also beyond capitalism. And the second point is, and that's very near to our project we did on the 18th century, about attunement, about human being and music and so on. And I think it's a very nice picture also for hearing the hyperobjects, that we have to develop accurate modes of human attunement to hyperobjects. So that's my first comment for the topic language, meta-language.
If I may again comment, the idea, the concept of meta-language implies the concept of language itself as a description of reality. Okay, but what if language is not a description of reality? What if language is condition of reality? So the language is there as a factor which constitutes reality, not describe it. So the whole dilemma about language and meta-language is irrelevant in that way of thinking. So again, this is one of my question marks about his ideas and conclusions. This also about the language. Maybe now it's the moment. What I said that I will talk a little bit more. It's obvious avoidance of his to mention the somehow word which is for him not appropriate, which is revolution. If you talk about capitalism, you know, you can say that you can suggest maybe that some social and cognitive, maybe even linguistic reconfiguration is necessary. Okay, and then use the rhetorics of speculative realism and hyperobjects and all of that. It's fine for me, but still I would argue that much more efficient critique would come from the tradition of Marxism and neo-Marxism. If we put it in the framework of political economy and cultural hegemony analysis of the problem, then maybe we have better platform to act about the emergency we are finding ourselves in. What if it would be useful and more awakening just to say that all of this is the result, simply resulting from this endless urge of the profit accumulation process, no? Because of that, we have found ourselves in this position. in which there are some things like hyperobjects there to face us with the consequences. But this awareness was already there for 200 years now, no? And it requires class conscience and the state of mind of the urgency characteristic for a revolutionary type of mind, not Heideggerian or phenomenological type of mind. And that would maybe be more efficient response than this rhetorical and phenomenological outcry.
Can I just inject something? As I understand it, Morten's point is not so much to answer the question how to act, but how to be in this situation, and how to cope with the human position in this urgent situation that we're in. So the urgency to act is not the message here. I think that's how I understood it, but rather to kind of see ourselves in the situation. I don't know if I am being clear about, but yes, I mean, I had that's why I read the whole book, because I was also, as I don't know, probably we all are aware of the urgency of the situation, and that's why we are interested in this sort of literature at all. And so yes, this was my question at the beginning, is there going to be a recipe, like how to solve the problem? But I think the core of this book and of this thinking is that there is no solution to the problem, but there is a way of accepting where we are and what we are, and start again from there.
I would like to add to that just on a moment. There's also Werner Erhard was, I don't know, he did a lot of trainings in the 70s, and something he talked about kind of that there's no meaning, so that he would do these seminars to get people to a point that there was no longer meaning. So no matter what had happened in their past, and that it became sort of irrelevant. So again, this everything is everything or nothing is nothing. But then his point was that from this moment, then you can kind of create something else, or you get to be the way that you behave in that no meaning, then creates a different sort of reality in that sense. So I think, yeah, that's a very interesting point that you're making. It's not necessarily what we do, but how do we be now? And that's a transition, I think, of entering into this sort of, I mean, I call it higher consciousness. I don't know if that's the right, you know, again, there's so many terminologies, but that's a complete change in our way of being that then results in different sorts of realities or navigations, I think, of the situation.
I think, I don't know, I'm just trying to understand this, but it seems to me that there is a detachment in cynicism that's now very productive, and this kind of detachment is maybe comes from a similar desire that we have in trying to sum up all our perspectives. So one of my favorite passages in the Heidegger text is when Heidegger tells us that the thing in itself is not a thing, right? So what kind of thing is a thing in itself, and how silly to sum up the many different perspectives on a thing with something that is not a thing. So I think this desire for a meta language, or is, we can look at one thing from different perspectives, but to call it then a cup, right, is an abstraction that sort of comes from the fantasy to see the cup from all different perspectives at once, and meta language empowers us to, with this fantasy to have the feeling that we can name something, and when we name something, we name it completely, right? And if that's even possible. So I think Morten is very much aware that this move towards a meta language, or this move towards abstraction, is very dangerous, and may like every generalization is a violation, right? This is where we have to be very, very careful, and we may not include a dimension, and that may have tremendous, terrible ramifications. So that's, I think that's something what also phenomenologists struggle with, right? They refuse to go on a meta level, but sort of meditate themselves into what is given. Yet I think, and that's for me the thing I struggle with. I think what Veronica said, we want to hear a solution. I think Timothy Morton also wants to recuperate idealism to some extent, right? So, and that's perhaps his the biggest struggle that he's struggling with. Like, he loves object-oriented ontologies, but he also likes to have a little bit of idealism in it, and that makes the hyperobject a hybrid in a way. Oh, another remark. What helps me to understand hyperobject is to think of its opposite, and I guess the opposite of the hyperobject would be a hypostasis, right? A notion that there is an essence within an object that underlies it and defines it, right? So hyperobject may be thought of as sort of the materialist approach to hypostasis, and that, I think, in part explains his idealistic penchant, or his he wants to have a Hölderlin in his object-oriented ontology or so.
I'm still thinking about the urgency of, yes, for doing something. So, but I think Morton sees the urgency as a symptom of our time. And so it's really about, it's more about the awareness that there is, I mean, what does that mean if we don't have anymore this this stasis as world, the being of world? If there is no, if we are in a space always moving, so I'm not so sure. It's not about speculative realism or something like that. I see your points, Reiten, about the issue of the urge accumulation of capital, but just thinking about the problem where we are in, where we don't have anymore any coordinates. I think his point is more just to be aware that we are just part of different hyperobjects we initiated 200 years ago.
Okay, I should comment on that.
No, you don't have to, but I mean, we also have to let behind notions and categories. I think that's also his point, in order to really to cope with the actual situation, not from an urgency. It's not an urgency case because we are already in it and we are already beyond the end of the time, the end of
yes,
of the world.
Yes, I would emphasize that his point is that in a way, in a different ways, I think that it's already too late, that the end actually, if I remember correctly, already occurred. So this, I can understand this in different ways. One is that Titanic already hit the iceberg. And this is our situation. No? And the other is a philosophical one, which means that we cannot avoid these hierarchies, oppositions, abstractions, instrumentality, utility, and this type of mind. So for him, this is also dead. It came to an end. But besides being just aware that it's like that, what else is there? I mean, I don't know. For that, we don't really. For me, I don't need hyperobject for that realization, for that awareness. It was already there for centuries somehow. I mean, Nietzsche declared that God is dead, no? And then somebody else declared that the man, the human, is dead, or the author is dead, and now the world is dead. So we know this, and still we find ourselves in a how to say it? We are struggling in this mud of the deposited uranium and carbon, which is already too late to do anything about. No? So I don't know. These are just thoughts.
I'm not so sure if he's saying it's too late. He has an. I think he has another image in the end. And I'm just. I mean, you don't have to answer my question, but my question would be, why cannot we leave these notions of abstractions and so on? I mean, yes, you're right. That's the function of language, to have concepts and abstract and to scope with so-called reality. But I think his point is another. He just wants to jump to this iceberg in order to know what's there, and for him it's very misty. And I don't agree with you that it's not the death of the world. It's just we cannot do as if we had this notion of world anymore. It's not a thing, and that's I'm sure that has a great potential for influencing politics, for example. What does that mean? I mean, we should really think in another way. If we know that time, that we are already that the time in 100,000 years is already present in our presence. I mean, that's a big issue for politics, and it's also a big issue for responding to it, for responsibility.
Yes. If I may now be just cynical, very, very briefly. Please, how can you connect politics and responsibility? This is contradiction in adjective. No? So, also another cynical point would be, which is of course totally something out of the sync from Morton, who says the cynicism is now out of the game. But to say it, I cannot resist not to say it. It's okay, because icebergs will anyway melt very quickly. So there will be no crash there, no? So, but also about the language issue, it is again in Heidegger, but not in his analysis of the tool and the thing, but in his analysis of hermeneutical circle, where he finds out how the interpretation is always already integrated in the theme, and we cannot jump out of it. You can say that it will be fantastic if we would be able to do this, which is his basically enthusiastic proposal. But this is just one among all the other options of the interpretation of the world. We can imagine a world as a capitalist a class struggle, or in any other way of or narration to it. So one among those narrations can be his, and this is the appeal of it is the appeal of this idea that we somehow can escape from the prison of language, from the prison of interpretation, from the prison of meanings and hierarchies and all of it. This is very, very tricky.
Reiten, just sorry for interrupting you, but it's not about leaving behind language or meta-language. Perhaps leaving behind meta-language, but it's leaving behind modernity. In the sense, perhaps in the sense of Foucault. That's his point. But just Christian.
Well, I have to introduce myself. I'm Christian Pesotti. I am a PhD student with Boris, and I partially agree with Zreten doubts, but personally it's been interesting to me because when I had to deal with the meta language, and because of my research I have to deal with language, it's a very tricky but interesting aspect, the fact about having the object and the way we deal with it. And I found out by reading this first chapter that after all we are dealing about politics with the Gramscian concept of hegemony as well, because when we talk about the hegemony, we also talk about creating consent, and creating the consent is also creating the awareness in this case, because the metaphor of Zreten of the Titanic crashing into the iceberg, yeah, it's perfect, but we have to think about what is the hegemony on that ship, because we are still dealing between people saying, oh, we are crashing, and overreacting, maybe not in a pragmatic way, and others deny, say no, it's just an entertainment trick from the from the crew, you know. While I also think that the the meaning, at least of Morton's work, but for what I got from the first chapter, is to create, in a sense, this consent, this new hegemony through the use of language. But as we know, it has positive aspect and negative aspect, because on the other side, we might get a total hegemony from the science point of view. I mean, we are the scientists. We are right about the global warming. Just do and shut up. And that's not the way to do, in my opinion. And I think it's really reflecting on this aspect, how to create through these hyperobjects a new consent and a new hegemony, which would mean also a new awareness of what we have to change, which is not necessarily at first the world economical paradigm, but having this awareness. And I think it's the real point of his work, because I don't think it's getting over the importance of the language. I think it's really, really about the language. It's a language issue, after all.
Yeah.
I want to add something. This Titanic example. What happened on the Titanic after it hits the iceberg? It was a running into the rescue boats. But to which world does the rescue boats bring you? In a way, to the next Titanic. So it's just dying later in the same way. I had the example in my head that we are living in the time phase when you're driving too fast with your car or your bicycle, and you're flying out of the curve. When you leave the street, and we are in this 1, 2, 3 seconds between losing contact with the ground and crashing against a tree or a mountain or whatever, and being dead. And the question for all the people I know is, for me also, is there a meaningful, a mindful being in these seconds? So how can we, and this is a question of language, and I agree absolutely with that. And with myth, with the mythology, we have to bring meaning and sense into the statements, into the words, into the stories we are telling. So that's the big issue to science, I think. And when Boris, when you started this meeting with the graph of temperature and CO2, and it's rising out of any proportion, it implicates the question, how can we stop that? But how can science, philosophers, actors, poetry, how can we create a reaction in the people that they say, okay, even if it doesn't stop the climate catastrophe, I will not fly anymore. I will sell my car, even if it's not stopping the whole thing. So getting rid of this caution bound Verbindung, that an acting is only then relevant if it has the right result. No, acting is relevant for me, for my soul, for my being, for my belief, for my rest and so on. So science, catastrophe, urgency, Titanic has to reach the people in a new way. And I think this Morton is looking for this new way. How can we reach the people? The revolution is on another field than we know. It will be a new revolution. Okay, full stop.
Okay, I think we are at the end. Thank you very much for your attention, your additions, your thinking deeper and broader. Yes, I hope that you can implement the results, what we spoke about, that the results not only, that you can implement them not only in your research questions, but also in your language and in your daily life. I mean, it's really about acting. You're right, Sreten. You're right, Michael. But it's also about not being sure anymore about our languages, our description modes. Okay, thank you very much for attending this first colloquium. I really hope that you can continue somehow this exchange also with, especially with Innsbruck. I'm very happy that Innsbruck was here, Bern was here, Slovenia was here. So let's keep in contact.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Same to
Goodbye.
you.
Be strong in weak times.
Hurling.
Bye-bye.